Anthropology in East Asia. First of all, Anglo-American hegemony in anthropology. The modern intellectual origin of anthropology was with Henry Louis Morgan and Edward Burnett Tyler, postulating that the United States and Western Europe were at the high point of contemporary civilization, with other societies throughout the world at various stages behind them in their development from savagery to barbarism to civilization. This is an ideology of West is best, disguised as science. This ideology, although of course deeply lamentable, is hardly surprising. It was formulated in an era when the British Empire stretched across the globe and the United States was in the final stages of subduing Native Americans. This intellectual attitude has long since given way as an overt ideology held by anthropologists. It was disavowed from Franz Boas onwards. Nonetheless, it continues indirectly, simply in that the most notable anthropologists in the world are European or American. I remember in the 1990s reading a volume in a Japanese bookstore, Bonkujin Nigaku no Meicho, explicating 50 great books in anthropology. 44 of these books were authored by writers from the American and Western European Center, from Morgan and Tyler to Levi-Strauss, Turner, Gertz, and Solons. Only 6 were Japanese, included as if an afterthought. Despite the fact that Japan has a long tradition of anthropology, dating back from the early 20th century, and despite the fact that Japan now has the second largest number of anthropologists in the world. Indeed, when anthropologists around the world think of the anthropology of Indonesia, they're likely to think of Clifford Geertz or Anat Singh, not of Indonesian anthropologists studying their own society. When anthropologists around the world think of the anthropology of India, it may be Louis Dumont or Arjun Appadurai who come to mind, not the very large number of anthropologists in India studying their own society. When anthropologists around the world think of Brazil, it may be Claude Lévi-Strauss and Triste Tropique that still come to mind more than Brazilian anthropologists and their long distinguished tradition. Partly, this is due to history. American, British, and French anthropologists' work dominated the discipline through the 20th century, with world anthropology emerging only in the past 20 years. 30 years from now, the situation may be different. Nonetheless, today, this remains the case. Implicitly, West is best. Today, world anthropology is coming to be accepted intellectually by anthropologists around the world. Many volumes have been published on world anthropologies. Editorial boards of major American and European anthropology journals now have a far more international membership than was the case 20 years ago. The recently formed World Anthropology Union that Gustavo was speaking of is about to become the primary anthropological association in the world. The Journal of Reprints, Deja Lu, that Gustavo founded, features every year the most notable anthropological articles from anthropological journals around the world, placing all the world's anthropological journals in a common platform, privileging none of them. The anthropological world has indeed changed. Still, Anglo-American hegemony has returned in another guise. Increasingly, universities around the world are concerned with global rankings of universities. These global rankings are determined by many factors, but one key factor is how much faculty publish in recognized journals, such as those that appear in citation indexes. Most prominent in anthropology is the Social Science Citation Index, although many universities and societies around the world use different citation indexes as well. The Social Science Citation Index is overwhelmingly Western, with most of its listed journals published in American or British venues. As the Japanese anthropologist Kuwayama Takami has noted, as of April 2017, a total of 82 journals are listed in SSCI under the category of anthropology. Of these, the US accounts for 38, the UK 21. The US accounts for 46% of these publications, and combined with the UK, these countries account for 72% of all journals. This represents, in effect, the return of Morgan and Tyler's West is best, a colonial intellectual discourse now revived as a post-colonial institutional discourse. This is not happening because of overt discrimination. The SSCI includes the most cited journals, and because Western societies, particularly the United States, have the most anthropologists in the world, their journals tend to be the most cited. But it does represent the institutional return of West as best. The effect of this is different in different societies. In some Latin American and European anthropological worlds, the SSCI can largely be ignored, I've heard. Whereas in China today, despite all its anti-Western rhetoric, if a junior anthropologist does not publish in an SSCI-listed journal, she may lose her job. This is more or less true in all societies around the world because of the increasing power of global university rankings in shaping university and scholarly policies. One key measure affecting global university rankings is that of how globally noteworthy a university's faculty is in their publications. Citation indexes, indicating the most cited and recognized journals in any given field, provide a handy, if superficial, guide for measuring this. And so there's much pressure for university administrators around the world to use this, and for faculty members around the world to conform to this. There are ways that SSCI can be combated, particularly if anthropologists around the world can be persuaded to cite journals from their own society or neighboring societies, rather than from the Anglo American anthropological core. However, this process of change may take a very long time. Anthropology will eventually overcome its legacy of West as best, but the ghost of this legacy has returned in institutional guise and appears to be immovable and increasingly expanding at present. As the deputy chair of the World Council of Anthropological Associations, I've been following very closely different anthropologies around the world. I'm convinced that anthropology in Latin America, because of its vital intellectual traditions, is intellectually best suited to challenge Anglo-American hegemony in anthropology. There's also the common language, or rather two somewhat interrelated languages, Spanish and Portuguese, in which Latin American anthropology is written, enabling a genuine alternative to English in anthropological publication and dissemination of knowledge. East Asia does not have this advantage. Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans have written in different, mutually unintelligible languages. Chinese, Japanese, and Korean anthropologists cannot understand one another's publications without intensive language instruction. There is also the historical legacy of Japanese imperialistic aggression in World War II, creating a distrust that has never quite subsided. However, East Asian anthropology, and East Asia as a whole, does have another advantage: money. Anthropology, in a very broad sense, follows the money, and in that sense, East Asia may be best suited to challenge Anglo-American domination in anthropology. Very broadly, there is a divide in the anthropological world that roughly corresponds to the division between global North and global South, and their economic division. This is the divide between anthropologists who primarily study their own society and those who primarily study other societies around the world. The tens of thousands of dollars required for an anthropologist to do fieldwork at some locale distant from one's own country is often obtainable for a junior anthropologist from the US or the UK or Japan, but is impossible for most junior anthropologists from Pakistan or Uganda or Indonesia or Colombia, I think. American, Western, European, and Japanese anthropologists tend to do field work in societies across the globe because they live in societies with the money to do so. Chinese, Indian, East European, Latin American, and African anthropologists typically study their own societies, partly because their societies lack the wealth for them to do anything else. If anthropologists study societies around the world, they're more likely to have global anthropological influence. If anthropologists study their own societies, they seem more likely to play the role of learned informants to anthropologists from elsewhere, a practice that the Brazilian Association of Anthropology recently condemned, very rightfully, asking for their own anthropologists to be given proper credit in publication. However, just as American political, economic, and cultural hegemony has been eroding in recent years, so too has its anthropological hegemony. Next, the rise of East Asia. Today, anthropology is not doing well in its societies of origin. In the United States and Great Britain, there are considerably fewer academic jobs for anthropologists than there are recent PhDs. I estimated in an article in American Anthropologist that there are more job openings for anthropologists in East Asia today than there are in Western Europe and the United States. As I said in that article, the United States and Western Europe are occupying a diminishing share of global GDP. China and Japan are now two of the world's three largest economies, and China will in a few years overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. Indeed, at present, as academic positions in anthropology are diminishing at U.S. and American and Western European universities, with newly minted PhDs unable to find jobs, the situation is better elsewhere in the world, particularly in East Asia. This is impossible to document because a significant number of anthropological positions in East Asia are not advertised, but filled through connections, both domestic and international. However, judging from the ever larger number of Western-educated anthropologists employed in East Asia, it seems to be the case. As world wealth moves from the U.S. and Europe to East Asia, anthropology will likely follow. In this sense, it may be that East Asia, in accordance with economics, will be the future of anthropology. But we do not yet see this. Let me now explore how and why this is the case by describing anthropology in different East Asian societies. I will focus particularly on Japan and China as the economic and anthropological behemoths in East Asia before turning briefly to other societies in East Asia. First, Japan. Before World War II, Japan, as a colonial power, sent its anthropologists to study ethnic groups in its colonies, from Taiwan to Manchuria. After the Second World War, for 3 decades, Japanese anthropologists largely studied only Japan, since there was no money to go elsewhere. From the 1970s on, a newly wealthy Japan again began sending its anthropologists all over the world. And today, Japanese anthropology covers the globe in its research, in a way very similar to anthropologies such as the United States and those in some societies in Western Europe. Japan has the second largest number of anthropologists in the world today, several thousand. Increasingly in recent years, there are also foreign anthropologists in Japan. Typically, they teach mostly in English, often to non-Japanese students, while Japanese anthropologists teach Japanese students in Japanese. Within global anthropology, Japanese anthropology has the reputation of being empirically very sound, with many Japanese anthropologists being highly able and talented as ethnographers in different societies around the world that they study, but not to be very theoretically sophisticated. The strength of Japanese anthropology is more empirical than theoretical. As Aoki Tamotsu wrote 30 years ago, in Japanese universities, the theories used are those created in the US and Europe. This remains largely the case today. On the other hand, Japanese anthropology has an impact within Japanese society beyond the academy in a way that is not the case in societies such as the United States. Whenever I visit Japan, I go to bookstores to marvel at their anthropology sections, which in good-sized bookstores number in the hundreds of volumes, by academic anthropologists. It's really wonderful to see Japanese office workers in their lunch breaks reading anthropology, with some Japanese ethnographies winning prestigious literary prizes. This shows how anthropology has a voice and audience beyond the small professional world in Japan. However, because most Japanese anthropologists write in Japanese, they do not tend to be read by anthropologists beyond Japan. As Yamashita Shinji has commented, because Japanese anthropologists write in Japanese, even when they criticize European or American anthropologists, they have no impact. Although Japanese anthropology has become more globally visible in recent years, in terms of the influence of its anthropology, Japan remains more or less marginalized. Most anthropologists outside of Japan, or in any case outside of East Asia and outside of the anthropologist fieldwork area, can name at most only one or two anthropologists based in Japan for their intellectual contribution to the field. I mean, I can ask people here, how many Japanese anthropologists can you name? Maybe one, maybe two, maybe three for a few of you. Very little. And yet that's the second biggest society in the world for anthropologists. Maybe I made a mistake. Tell me later if I have, but that's my assumption. This is largely because of language. Most older Japanese anthropologists cannot or will not write in English, let alone Spanish, and very few scholars outside of Japan can read Japanese. But Japanese anthropology is changing, and there is now more and more English used in presentation and publication. The Japanese Review of Cultural Anthropology, published since 1998, offers Japanese anthropology in English primarily for international readers, although there don't seem to be very many such readers. But writing for a foreign audience can be remarkably difficult. I co-edit the journal Asian Anthropology, published by Taylor and Francis in the UK. While we work extremely hard to have referees from societies beyond the Anglo-American core, such as from Japan, if a submitted piece does not address any anthropological audience outside of Japan, it's unlikely we'll be able to publish it, simply in that our readers from around the world will not know how to contextualize it in terms of anthropology. Now, there's long been a sense among older Japanese anthropologists that anthropology beyond Japan does not really matter. Addressing an international audience does not really matter. Younger Japanese anthropologists are, however, different because of government regulations on universities by the Ministry of Education, attempting to change Japan's low place in global university rankings. Many junior scholars now feel forced to write in English for the sake of their careers. Some junior scholars welcome this, but others are really angered, saying, Japanese is the language of Japan. Why should I not work in my own language? This is common sense. However, if Japanese anthropologists write only in Japanese, then the world outside of Japan, not just Americans and British, but also Koreans, Chinese, Taiwanese, Hong Kongese, Singaporeans, Indians, Europeans, Africans, Latin Americans, anthropologists and students and lay people alike will largely ignore them. Now, translation is certainly possible, but generally books are translated from foreign languages into Japan. The traffic from Japanese to foreign languages happens far less for economic reasons. It's certainly possible for Japanese anthropologists to write in their fieldwork languages, and this is an important contribution to knowledge in the society in which they work. But the global lingua franca is, for better or worse, English. And to communicate globally, writing in English is the most direct way to do it. Now, this is a contradiction that Japanese anthropologists face. Should they write in their own language or in English? Most overwhelmingly choose Japanese unless they are forced for career reasons to do otherwise. But this leads to a larger question. Do anthropologists around the world have a responsibility to contribute to the global development of the discipline? And, sorry, this is offensive to many of you, I'm sure, if English is global anthropology's lingua franca, then doesn't this need to be done in English? Now, many Latin American anthropologists vigorously resist this, saying, let's make Spanish or Portuguese an alternative language for a global anthropology. But East Asian anthropologists reject this and seek their own languages to be candidates for an anthropological second lingua franca. If Japanese were deemed as an alternative global language for anthropology, since Japan, as I've said, has the second largest number of anthropologists in the world, not only would anthropologists around the world complain, certainly Colombians as well as Indians and Nigerian anthropologists would all in common say, who in the world reads Japanese? But also Chinese anthropologists would complain, Korean anthropologists would complain. Writing in Japanese means almost inevitably that one is almost entirely confined to Japan. Now, anthropologists in a number of other societies, such as Norway and Sweden and Israel, are able to publish influential books and articles in both their own native languages and in English. I'm thinking of the English writing of somebody like Thomas Hyland Erickson. His writing is remarkably clear and straightforward, perhaps because he is Norwegian, not a native speaker of English. At the same time, his writing is highly influential. Could Japanese anthropology do the same? Could a Japanese anthropology emerge that might make anthropology relevant to a larger public, not just in Japan, but the push towards English in universities in Japan has been spearheaded by the Japanese government. But in most other areas, the state stays out. This is not the case in China, where the role of the state is particularly pronounced, probably more than anywhere else in the world. To investigate anthropology in mainland China, I've interviewed a number of mainland Chinese anthropologists over the past year, whose words I quote from. This is personally particularly important because I live in Hong Kong, and there's at least a chance that I'll lose my job or even go to jail because of China's increasing control over Hong Kong. This means that I have to understand anthropology as practiced in China, which is why I worked so hard on this paper I wrote. Not this one, but the one on Chinese anthropology. This one, too. Anthropologists in China study aspects of Chinese society. There have been some recent calls for Chinese anthropologists to study societies beyond China, but this has not yet happened. Anthropology in China is often framed as ethnology, the study of minority ethnic groups, or what they call in China minority nationalities. This is a study particularly sponsored by the state, with research funding specifically awarded in accordance with how much a research project serves the aims of the state. Because ethnologists may or may not be deemed anthropologists, the number of Chinese anthropologists is difficult to calculate. I estimate about 1,000 in total, judging from membership numbers in various anthropological associations in China. These anthropologists are restricted if they write up their research findings in Chinese. As one foreign-trained junior anthropology professor told me, when I submit journal articles to Chinese journals, I'm told that the topics I'm writing about are too sensitive to get published. I was told for one paper I wrote that I should change the tone completely to discuss how well the government has done dealing with the problems I discuss. I myself have had a recent book contracted by a Chinese university press and translated, but then blocked from publication in China, as has also been experienced by several of my Hong Kong colleagues. There's also the problem of refereeing. As a junior anthropologist told me in a fit of exasperation, to be honest, most Chinese anthropologists publish rubbish in Chinese. Someone told me that anything can get published if you have a good relation with the editor. Double-blind review in Chinese journals doesn't work because you know who's refereeing your paper. Now, this is a situation in many anthropological communities in which writing in one's native language is stressed. Because these communities are small, the referee system can't fully function. Beyond this, there's the fact that if an anthropologist publishes in Chinese, they may have no readers beyond the Sinophone world. As a senior professor explained, while some good theory is indeed written by Chinese anthropologists, the problem is that it's written in Chinese. Even if they have a good theory, it's unknown to Western scholars, he said. This echoes what Japanese anthropologists have said, as we earlier saw. Writing in one's native language all but guarantees being ignored beyond one native language in East Asia. The alternative is to write in English. Chinese anthropologists, like other anthropologists around the world, are pushed to write in a foreign language that they may not have mastered and are thus placed at a disadvantage compared to native English speakers. Anglo American anthropology in its referee system may impose its own imperialistic barriers in referees' judgments as to what anthropology should be. However, writing in English does have a certain advantage in China. It enables Chinese anthropologists to escape censorship from authorities and colleagues at home. As one junior professor told me, yes, I think my department would be happy if I published my piece in English as long as no one reads it. and notices that I'm criticizing the government. If I publish only in English, I'd be fine in terms of my career. It's better to publish in English than in Chinese. And I'd be safe because no one would read my paper except for the title. This reflects a paradox in Chinese anthropology. Authorities within and beyond one's university may sometimes object when an anthropologist uses what's deemed to be an excessively Western approach to anthropology. As one scholar trained overseas said, "I wrote an anthropological article in Chinese and I was told, 'Why are you using all those Western theories? Why don't you learn from Chinese theorists?' At the same time, however, it remains better for one's academic career to publish in English than in Chinese, since global university rankings and citation indexes heavily privilege English rankings, as we've seen. And Chinese university authorities are well aware of this. Chinese anthropology seeks to assert its own Chinese perspectives, an indigenization and Sinicization of anthropology, but it also seeks recognition within a global anthropological power structure based in part on citation indexes, which reinforces an Anglo American anthropological norm. This is a remarkable contradiction. A Chinese anthropological paradigm is sought, but one which will have to pass Anglo-American gatekeeper referees in order to attain full validation. That's absurd, but that's what we see. Funding is linked to this contradiction. Academic anthropologists in China are expected to apply for funding for their research. While funding from sources outside of China is possible, the overwhelming source of funding is the Chinese government, which typically funds projects that are development-oriented, serving the state's goals. If you want the money, you have to follow the protocol, being either pro-government or apolitical, one professor told me. Another professor was critical of grant proposals for their praise of Chinese leaders. As he said, in writing grant proposals, so many of them have in their titles praising Xi Jinping, the dictator of China. In writing grant proposals, you've got to praise Xi Jinping. This is ridiculous, but in applying for a grant, they feel they have to do it. However, if one writes up one's research findings in English, one may have difficulty getting published if one does not provide a degree of critical political analysis. This is the bias of Western referees. So funding thus comes nationally bearing one agenda, but prestige in publish comes internationally bearing a different and often opposing agenda. This is the remarkable contradiction of Chinese anthropology, controlled by the nationalistic Chinese state, but a state that seeks above all foreign validation for its anthropology. Okay, let me very briefly discuss now three other societies, Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, before I move on to a larger conclusion. In Korea today, there are perhaps 200 anthropologists. About half of the papers published in the flagship Journal of Anthropology in Korean Cultural Anthropology are about Korea, and half are about other societies, typically China, Japan, or Southeast Asia. Older anthropologists in Korea, just as in Japan, often publish only in Korean. Senior anthropologists argue that local Korean language writing about Korean issues should be valued just as much as the global writings by Korean scholars in English for a global and particularly a Western and American audience. But younger scholars find themselves in a different academic world. As one Korean anthropologist told me several months ago, the Korean academic standard has changed. Now you're highly encouraged to publish papers in English international journals. Now they even care about citation indexes. They really care about the internationalization of institutions. One of the things they check from faculty members is, do you have international publications? In the recent past, Korean language publications were most important, but not now because of citation indexes. Unlike their elders, younger Korean anthropologists are all but forced to publish in English, this anthropologist maintained. Taiwan. Over the past 70 years, China abolished a number of its traditions. And it also at times blocked anthropological research, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s. This has meant that for many overseas-based anthropologists, Hong Kong and Taiwan have been where they've conducted ethnographic research on Chinese societies. Linked to this, Taiwan and Hong Kong at one time seemed to be replacing mainland China as the center for a construction of a Chinese anthropology. The Taiwan, Hong Kong-based anthropologist Chao Chen discussed this in his writings in the 1980s. But those days are gone. As a Taiwanese anthropologist told me recently, I don't think that anyone in Taiwanese anthropology now is thinking about a Chinese anthropological paradigm. There is more of a Taiwanese identity now as compared to the past. Taiwanese reject their belonging to China. Because in Taiwan, so many of its 100 or so anthropologists have obtained PhDs overseas, particularly in the US, there's little resistance to publishing in English, although there is a vibrant popular anthropology movement in Taiwan written and spoken in Chinese. The hegemon faced by these Taiwan anthropologists is not the United States, but China. Not intellectual, but political, and potentially militarily, as the ongoing threat of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan remains. Finally, Hong Kong. Anthropology in Hong Kong, with some 25 anthropologists, has become Anglo-American in its orientation over the past 2 decades, in terms of publication and teaching, under the sway of an intense audit culture, monitoring professors' performances at every turn, reflecting not the Chinese state, but global corporate managerialism. Taiwan and China can perhaps serve as models for a Chinese anthropology that's largely free of state coercion. However, Chinese control over Hong Kong has become tighter and more restrictive in the last 2 years, a trend that will no doubt continue. There's a clear possibility of China exerting greater and greater political influence over Taiwan as its global power increases. The comparative independence from the state of anthropology in Hong Kong and Taiwan is thus under considerable threat, and we don't know how this may come out. Okay, finally, anthropology in East Asia and the world. Anthropologists in the different East Asian societies are in such different circumstances that they cannot easily be unified into a common anthropology. If East Asian anthropologists could become more unified, then they could become a major anthropological force in the world, in parallel with the growing economic presence of East Asia in the world. But anthropologists in these different societies are engaged in different projects and typically write in different languages. One effort to overcome this fragmentation has been the East Asian Anthropological Association, an association for anthropologists based in different East Asian countries that meets once a year, specifically so that Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese, and Hong Kong anthropologists can all learn from one another. Early in its history, over a decade ago, there was an effort to make Mandarin Chinese the language of the East Asian Anthropological Association. But, of course, non-Chinese scholars objected. Later, there was an effort to have simultaneous interpreters present at these meetings, but the expense proved to be too much. In recent years, the lingua franca of EAAA has been, not without regret among many of its participants, English. The place of English in East Asian anthropologies is quite different from its role among Latin American anthropologists. Spanish is the lingua franca for many anthropologists on 3 different continents. When Latin American anthropologists say, let's make Spanish the alternative to English in global anthropology, they can very plausibly make this claim. You can plausibly make this claim, although, of course, anthropologists from East Asia would object. Similar linguistic claims could not be made in East Asia, since knowledge of Japanese, Chinese, and Korean is largely confined to the societies in which these languages are spoken. East Asian anthropologists write in their own languages, and a Chinese anthropologist is unlikely to read Japanese or Korean, just as a Japanese anthropologist is unlikely to read Chinese. These anthropologists may read English or may read Western articles translated into their own languages, but will probably not read one another's work or pay attention to one another's work. English in China, in particular, has a quite different resonance from what it has in Latin America. One Chinese anthropological journal editor explained to me that his journal publishes in English rather than in Chinese, largely so that it can escape observation by the Chinese state, whose bureaucrats can't read English. English is thus not the language of the hegemon for him, but the language enabling escape from the hegemon, for him, the Chinese government. For many Chinese anthropologists, as we've seen, English is essential as the language enabling them to reach an anthropological world that cannot be observed by their own state. For anthropologists in other East Asian countries, the state doesn't quite so fully intrude in their anthropology. But English is still pushed by the state due to concerns over university rankings. Beyond this increasing bureaucratic pressure, English is seen by many East Asian anthropologists as the primary means of moving beyond their own societal bounds. It is a global lingua franca, for better or worse. Aside from language, the Anglo-American hegemonon of anthropological influence remains. If anthropologists of East Asia don't tend to read one another, they do tend to read instead the most influential Western, and particularly American and British anthropologists and other theorists. I've discussed how anthropology was born as a colonial discipline embodying West as best, but that the discipline of anthropology might potentially outgrow this. But in East Asia, not yet. It revolves around a center of Western anthropology. Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese, and Hong Kong anthropologists are more likely to know the work of American anthropologists than they are to know the work of one another. East Asian anthropologists everywhere are being encouraged to publish in English, with cash rewards being paid in many Chinese universities to those Chinese anthropologists who publish in top Western journals. The same is the case in Japan and Korea, although the monetary reward may not be there. Because of global rankings in universities and the preponderance of emphasis on English language publications. Publishing in Anglo-American journals typically means being refereed by Anglo-American referees, and thus forced to tailor one's work to conform to the standards of those foreign gatekeepers. As Kuwayama Takami has written, influential scholars in the core countries are in a position to decide what kinds of knowledge should be given authority and merit attention. The peer review system at prestigious journals reinforces this structure. Thus, knowledge produced on the periphery, however significant and valuable, is destined to be buried locally unless it meets the standards and expectations of the core. What this means is, if an East Asian anthropologist seeks to be heard in the United States, she must sound American in her theoretical concerns and style of argumentation in order to get past referee gatekeepers. As an editor of the Global Anthropological Journal of reprints Déjà Lu that Gustavo earlier discussed, I've this year been interviewing editors of anthropological journals from around the world. And I've heard from many editors of well-known American journals emphasizing how they're continuing to expand their editorial boards. Great, but having a few non-American referees is not enough to really help. Anthropology is formulated in different ways in different societies, with different concerns and aims. This is true in Japan, China, and Korea, as well, of course, as in different Latin American societies. As long as the majority of referees of a given Anglo-American journal take for granted that the anthropology of their society is the standard by which anthropology is to be judged, and as long as global university rankings continue their stranglehold, then Anglo-American hegemony will remain. Not absolutely, because individual anthropologists can and do often transcend their national backgrounds, but broadly. This is impossible to escape. And yet, this might not be quite as negative as it seems in the context of East Asian anthropology. If East Asian anthropologists do indeed write in English, then they can read one another, as they cannot when they write in their own native languages. Now, this is easy for me to suggest. I mean, I'm a native speaker of English, and I often get made fun of for this. Come on, it's easier for you than for us. Absolutely. I'm also a non-Asian by birth. This may be far harder to accept for an East Asian whose native language is not English and who may suffer through the scorn of referees in trying to master a remarkably difficult foreign language. Nonetheless, this is perhaps the way in which the fragmentation of East Asian anthropology can perhaps finally be transcended. Or maybe Google Scholar can do this in decades to come. As I hope is apparent from all I'm saying here, I intensely oppose the hegemony of Anglo-American anthropology. This is why I've chosen to spend my professional life as an anthropologist in Hong Kong. I believe that anthropology can only become a discipline worth continuing if it can transcend this Anglo-American hegemony, to become a discipline of everyone, studying and learning from everyone else on the planet. the most likely way for this to happen, given current economic trends in the world, is for East Asian anthropology, and perhaps Latin American anthropology too, to emerge as potent counterforces to Anglo-American anthropology. And the most likely way for this to happen in East Asia, given the current fragmentation of East Asian anthropology, is through English. I dislike having to say this. I really don't want to be saying this, but it may be true. This may perhaps also be the case for Latin American anthropology as well. Or perhaps Latin American anthropology can transcend this with the increasing global influence of Spanish. This global movement is important because anthropology, like other disciplines in the arts and social sciences, is increasingly endangered around the world as universities increasingly emphasize science and technology. If anthropologists insist that there are multiple anthropologies in the world that are each unique and cannot be compared, then our discipline runs the risk of being sidelined and seen as irrelevant. Indeed, what we need is instead a singular anthropology, one that can transcend its Anglo-American core of origin, to become a truly global anthropology, an anthropology of the entire world. Citation indexes are already pushing anthropologists around the world into a common Anglo-American-centered anthropological world. But what we need is a global anthropology, such as that beginning to take shape through the World Anthropological Union, to fight back against that, to stand up for a truly global anthropology. The forms this takes remains to be seen. I'm old and probably won't be a part of this emergence beyond a few more years. But anthropology students, such as those of you in here from Colombia, as well as my own students in Hong Kong and China, are the future. It will be really exciting to see the new forms of global anthropology that you will be shaping in decades to come. Thank you.
Al espacio de preguntas, el profesor Cristóbal va a hacer la traducción. Acá hay una, Marcelo, Mateo, Esteban. Voy a recoger 3. ¿Listo? Entonces, dale, Marcelo. Vamos a hacer grupos.
Bueno, buenos días. Digamos que hay algo que yo quisiera ver. Pues que no vi a lo largo de la presentación, se hablaron pues de diferentes elementos de las antropologías de Asia Oriental, pero hay un elemento que yo quisiera, digamos, no sé si se podría conocer más, digamos algo así en elementos generales, y son los programas de formación en antropología, digamos un poco de una forma muy general, cómo se enseña la antropología en estos lugares, como qué esquemas se usan, cuáles son los temas principales de esos programas de formación. Y quisiera relacionar esta pregunta con otra que digamos que se relaciona con una cuestión que ha sido general, incluso con la presentación anterior, y es en esta idea de construir antropologías disidentes o antropologías que digamos estén en contra de esa hegemonía de producción en antropología. ¿Cómo pensar los programas en antropología? ¿Qué relación tener con los programas de antropología? Los programas a través de los programas de antropología y de la formación y de cómo se enseña en las universidades y en diferentes instituciones, podemos pensar que de ahí salga algo distinto y que construyamos, digamos, una antropología disidente desde esas formas de enseñanza y desde esos esquemas de formación. Y pues esto es un poco contradictorio, pero yo voy a citar a un antropólogo estadounidense para eso. Si los programas de antropología pueden convertirse en un ataúd donde se muera algo, o podrían ser una crisálida de la cual pues salga pues una mariposa bien bonita y ya.
No, vamos a hacer uno a uno.
¿Y cómo espera que traduzca yo esa intervención guido-baronesca? Esa es la influencia de Guido Barón en nosotros, que las preguntas son más largas que la intervención. He wants to know how anthropologists taught in East Asia, basically. I mean, he is taught. I mean, what the curricula teaches.
Y la segunda.
Anthropology is taught in East Asia the same way it's taught here. Except the focus is more on East Asia, no doubt, but I think the basic ideas of the discipline are pretty much the same. There isn't much difference. The only difference is in mainland China, where anthropology is not political. But certainly in Japan, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Korea, many of the concerns are the same kinds of concerns you are taught here. It really is not very different. If I were to come here and teach for a year, except for the language, you'd probably find it no different. Or if one of you were to come to Hong Kong and teach for a year, you'd probably find it no different from here, I think.
Pues que se enseña básicamente lo mismo, pero no sabe cómo sabe que se enseña acá. Y que tal vez salvo, con la excepción de China, donde la antropología es decididamente apolítica, la enseñanza es muy similar. And the second part of a very long question is how to articulate a dissident anthropology in professional training. How to do that? A dissident, an alternative anthropology in professional training. How to teach an alternative anthropology, a dissident anthropology that fights against the hegemony.
I think that teaching dissident anthropology is the easy part, because it's very easy to teach alternative ideas to a class of students. The hard part is the way institutions are structured. For example, you may, if you teach anthropology, teach intensely about Anglo-American hegemony and how you seek to overcome it. But if your university says you must publish in English or you will lose your job, you probably will. And so I think the problem is less teaching, which is easy to do. It's more a problem of what anthropologists have to do to fit this larger hegemonic situation we're in.
El problema no es enseñar una antropología alternativa o disidente, que eso resultaría fácil, se puede enseñar a los estudiantes algo distinto. Lo realmente difícil es la presión institucional, sobre todo con esta hegemonía que ha descrito en la charla. Entonces hay una tremenda diferencia entre enseñar algo, que es algo más fácil, y cómo los profesores tienen que adecuarse a esos estándares que las instituciones a veces imponen. Eso. ¿Algo más?
Bueno. ¿Sí se escucha? Allá. Bueno, un poco creo que lo nombraste en la presentación, y es que también como la existencia de antropologías hegemónicas, en este caso pues como una idea occidentalizada de la misma, implica pues pensarse otros factores, ¿sí? Económicos, políticos. La existencia de esos factores pues influye también mucho en la existencia pues hegemónica, por así decirlo, de las antropologías. En ese sentido, pues yo me preguntaría es cómo, o sea, de qué manera pueden conversar esas antropologías que no son hegemónicas, ¿cierto? Bueno, entre sí y con otras disciplinas y con otros agentes del cambio para transformar esas relaciones de poder. Eso sería.
No funciona, esto sí funciona. He wants to know how anthropology, as has been taught in the universities, can link up with other agents of change, of social movements and the like.
That's an excellent question. how can anthropology be relevant beyond the classroom? That's key. I, to speak personally, have been quite involved in this because of the Hong Kong protests of 2019 that you may have seen. Should I be on the sidelines or should I be engaged in these protests because I'm a Hong Konger, I'm a Hong Kong citizen? How much should we conduct teach-ins and so on? But we go back to the great problem of how do we know we're right? There was that wonderful exchange in the 1990s between Nancy Shepherd Hughes and Roy D'Andrade in Current Anthropology, with D'Andrade saying anthropology is a science, whereas Shepherd Hughes saying, no, 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 we must pursue justice. But are we right? And when I have discussions with Latin American anthropologists, many of them are activists. That's great, but there's also room for skepticism. For example, I know of a number of American feminist anthropologists who go to Japan and tell Japanese women, you should be struggling for your rights. And the Japanese women might say, are you crazy? I have it better off than my husband does. And so there's a problem of ethnocentrism if justice is pursued without a considerable degree of sensitivity to cultural differences. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. The key to anthropology is to create a better world. And we have the way to do this, I think, because of our knowledge of other societies. It should not only be linked to one's own society, but to this global vision of creating a better society. One example that I can give of this is how human rights back in the 1940s and 50s was thought to be untouchable by anthropologists because it was culturally different in different places. Now, human rights are embraced by anthropologists at large. Now, we still need to be careful to make sure that we're not hegemonic in our own anthropological vision here. There are multiple views. I mean, look at the United States. I hate supporters of Donald Trump, but I have to understand them. So understanding, too, is enormously required. I'm giving a rather poor answer to your question, I fear. I sympathize with this. I'm doing all I can in my own work, certainly. We must do this, but it will take a multitude of different forms and to be taken with great sensitivity. Sorry, that's too long.
Ahora sí. Ahora voy a traducir lo que dijo Gordon en 10 segundos. Y me acuerdo de una vez que hicimos un documental en Santa Leticia y estábamos con las estatuas y Ángel María Yoinó, un muy respetadísimo tehuala de la época, habló durante media hora en Nasayuhue. Entonces yo le pregunté al traductor después qué dijo. Dijo, Ángel María dijo que los ancestros son muy importantes. Media hora. Bueno, y ¿qué dice Gordon? Que el debate que se hace en antropología desde hace muchos años es permanecer al margen o estar en el centro de la lucha, que es un debate fundamental, pero que en su opinión no se puede solucionar apelando a criterios universales, sino a términos de sensibilidad cultural, y apeló, pues estaba hablando por ejemplo, el ejemplo de la justicia, o sea, cómo la justicia tiene que ser sensible a contextos culturales específicos. No puede la lucha en la que en la antropología se puede eventualmente y se debería involucrar, apelar a términos universales. Sería eso.
Well, you mentioned linguistic monolingual ideology from Anglo American anthropology and economical hegemony, and we all know the close link between colonialism and the rise of anthropology, especially in the Anglo-European, French, and British context. And you mentioned the linguistic question and also the current rising economical hegemony of China. And, but the fact that Chinese anthropology is focused mainly on Chinese subjects. How is that Chinese hegemony, economical hegemony, especially in countries from the global south, like Africa or in Latin America, has not led to Chinese anthropology of thinking in the same way as Western anthropology in taking advantage of this hegemony and expand Chinese social science in the same way Western academia has done.
Excellent question.
I need to translate first to Spanish, translate into Spanish for public. le preguntaba por qué si sabemos bien la relación entre colonialismo y antropología en el surgimiento y desarrollo de las antropologías hegemónicas euroamericanas y europeas, y estamos en este momento mirando un crecimiento de la hegemonía económica china en los países del sur global, como en África y en Latinoamérica, pero la antropología china sigue concentrándose principalmente en temas de China. ¿Y por qué la Academia Antropológica China no ha visto, digamos, o no piensa en los mismos términos esta hegemonía como una expansión de las ciencias sociales chinas a los sitios sobre los cuales hoy tiene cierta hegemonía económica?
It is simply a matter of time. China now has the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is spreading Chinese economic influence to Central Asia, into Africa, and into Latin America as well. I can guarantee you that unless the Chinese economy collapses, which might happen given COVID-19, that you will see Chinese anthropologists in 10, 15, 20 years increasingly asserting their influence. So the general rule seems to be that first the economy, and then a decade later, the anthropologists. That happened in Japan, where it was really in the 1960s that the Japanese economy began to shoot up. And then only in the 1970s to 80s, you saw Japanese anthropologists around the world. So the same thing will happen to China, by the way. And as for the United States, we do see a degree of economic decline. When will that begin to affect anthropology? Well, maybe it already is, but it often takes time. There's a lag time. And it may be 20 or 30 or more years before we see that play out, but it will. Anthropology, for better or worse, mirrors the economics of the world. So it's going to happen.
Bueno, el profesor Mathews dice que digamos que hay una brecha entre la hegemonía económica en términos temporales y la hegemonía, digamos, o la expansión de las ciencias sociales en el mismo sentido que habíamos mencionado antes. Dice que ocurrió más o menos en el Japón, que fue principalmente, estuvo haciendo antropología japonesa principalmente, pero en algún punto empezó a expandirse hacia el resto del mundo y él afirma que será cuestión de un par de décadas que veamos efectivamente que la antropología china empiece también a tener influencia en los lugares donde tiene influencia hoy en día, el Asia Central, el sur de África y Latinoamérica.
Okay, the last one. It comes from the internet. What are the points and spaces of encounter, if there are any, between Asia and Latin America that you see necessary to push and to create? Do you see that possible? The points of encounter between Asia and Latin America, it doesn't say if in anthropology or whatever.
Is the link possible? Is that the basic question?
Right, just establish links between Asia and Latin America. And let's say in anthropology, and if you see that necessary and if you see how to do that.
I would love to see the link, but it's difficult. The linguistic barrier is the greatest. Because already, for example, I have given talks like this in mainland China, and it's been the same linguistic difficulty. In Japan, I give talks in Japanese, so there's not much of a problem. And in Hong Kong, people speak English, but on the mainland, people speak Mandarin. And so English is a problem. So what kind of common language can be spoken? That's a basic problem. It would make perfect sense to have a great linkage. It would be extraordinarily good if it could happen, but it's difficult. And another matter related to this is that simply there is a difference in ideology. I look at WCA, which Gustavo was talking about earlier. You do see a real difference in view often between Latin American anthropologists and East Asian anthropologists. The Latin American anthropologists say, let's make Spanish the second language. East Asian, no, let's make Chinese, let's make Japanese. Beyond this, the Latin American anthropologists may say, let's be revolutionary in our anthropology and not follow Anglo-American hegemony. The East Asians may say, well, okay, but if we don't write in English, we're trapped in our own Chinese society. We can't get out. So there are ideological differences too. Now, that question is an excellent question. We need to overcome this if possible. How we can do it, we'll see. Maybe we should all speak Esperanto.
Bueno, el profesor Mathews hace referencia a que el principal obstáculo probablemente es la barrera lingüística, que se ha propuesto en diferentes escenarios la posibilidad de encontrar, como lo mencionó en la ponencia, lenguas francas diferentes, específicamente el castellano como una posibilidad a nivel global, pero los académicos del sudeste asiático pues no lo ven como una posibilidad. Y en ese sentido pues sería, digamos, muy difícil lograr una lengua franca que pudiera crear esos vínculos entre la antropología asiática y la antropología latinoamericana, pero no obstante, digamos, es claro que la gente empieza a ver esa necesidad, y esa necesidad pasa por entender que si solo se habla en la lengua en la que digamos, del país de origen, pues ciertamente hay una restricción de qué puede salir de la antropología a otros escenarios globales.
Y va a ser muy cortica. Profe, ¿usted no piensa que está mal planteado el problema en estos dos sentidos? Primero, ¿por qué tiene que haber una lengua franca y por qué tiene que haber una antropología global? ¿No será que las nuevas generaciones, en lo que ellos hacen todo el día, yo conozco chicos que están conectados en Tumaco con gente en Hong Kong, hablando entre inglés y castellano, o con gente que habla entre inglés y portugués? ¿No será que nosotros estamos muy viejos y no estamos viendo lo que el mundo es hoy, por un lado, y por otro lado, ¿no será que nos estamos planteando mal la pregunta de para que una lengua franca, para que los gringos nos lean? A nosotros no nos importa que nos lean los gringos. Nosotros necesitamos es producir y discutir desde muchas maneras y no solamente en términos académicos. Ni miedo.
Eduardo asks, do you think the problem is not well articulated? In what sense? Do we really need a lingua franca and a global anthropology linked to it? Or do we can have let future generations, which are already connected in the language they connect themselves, between different places in the global south without going through Anglo-American hegemony to communicate? Is it possible that we are too old, so looking for this kind of problem, and it may be possible to be articulated in different terms and see other kind of anthropologies flourish?
I think it was possible in the past, where you had less global pressure for university rankings. In many of the societies I know about, Koreans could work in Korean and contribute to Korean society. Paraguayans could work in Spanish and contribute to their society and the other Latin American anthropologies. Nepalis could work in Nepali and so on. That was possible to do. With increasing pressure for global rankings, that becomes more difficult because anthropology is increasingly required to be like a science. And let's look at this in terms of, say, medical science. It would make no sense to have a medical science in one language and in another language without being able to speak in common. That's the essence of science. It's supposed to be universal. Now, I know Gustavo has often spoken, at least in the past, when we've argued about this, about the need for multiple anthropologies, and I can understand that. Still, it seems to me, given these universal pressures for university rankings, we do need to have a single anthropology, and for that, we do need a common language. Languages, because we will be able to translate instantaneously. We will see, that's my hope, so that we can remove the hegemony of English, of which I am very unfortunately a bearer.
El profesor Mathews dice que efectivamente es posible seguir teniendo antropologías en diferentes partes del mundo, en japonés, en nepalí, en castellano, y que eso no necesariamente es un problema, pero sí considera que debe existir una antropología global. El problema principalmente son los rankings académicos, que ciertamente están dominados por la antropología, la academia metropolitana, y que las personas de los diferentes lugares donde se hace antropología están sometidos a los rankings académicos que mayoritariamente pasan por las publicaciones en inglés. En ese sentido, el profesor Mathews propone que probablemente en el futuro la traducción automática con máquinas tipo Google Translate podrían ser una opción para transformar esa situación, digamos, a mediano plazo.
Hay una última pregunta, entonces vamos a esa pregunta, terminamos y volvemos a las 2:30 después de almuerzo.
Listo. Entonces,
2:30.
Pues mi pregunta es que si se podría decir que las instituciones no reconocen a los investigadores por su lenguaje y que al usted dar su discurso en inglés y no en español sigue sosteniendo esta hegemonía.
She asked that language is a barrier that forbids global anthropology to recognize scholars that are not speakers of English. Do you think this is a barrier for the recognition of other scholars around the world that are not English speakers? And at the same time, don't you think the fact that you come here to Colombia to give a talk in English is the same thing? That you are contributing to the not recognition of non-English speakers by the fact that you come here and give a talk in Colombia in English?
Well, if so, then don't invite me. I mean, I didn't volunteer to come. Now, you are certainly welcome to confine the anthropological world you're in to Spanish, and that's fine. That's perfectly okay. The problem with that kind of view is that you would be separating yourself not only from people like me, but also from Japanese, Chinese, Indians, Africans, the whole array of world anthropologies. Now, if you want to do that, fine. That's perfectly okay. But it seems to me that there is a global impact that you can have. It's deep. Now, can you do that if you write in Spanish? You may well be able to, because Spanish is a major world language. So that I think an anthropologist could indeed do this in Spanish. So far, the only anthropologists who seem to have a big impact on America are French. And they've had an enormous impact writing only in French, not anthropologists, but Foucault, Bourdieu, the whole, the whole circle of European anthropologists. But as for your question, you can fight Anglo-American hegemony, and you're right to fight it, and I'm trying to do it myself. But at the same time, if you confine yourself only to your own language, you are doing what we say in English is preaching to the choir. You're talking to people who only already agree with you. And that might be a problem, but that's for you to decide.
El profesor Mathews dice que, bueno, entonces, ¿para qué lo invitan? Para empezar. Y a partir de ahí, pues él dice, yo voluntariamente me acojo a este tipo de espacios y que ciertamente hablar únicamente en castellano o reproducir academia únicamente en castellano sigue siendo una opción, pero que esa opción también implica confinarnos a la esfera hispanohablante en nuestras antropologías y no solo restringir o, digamos, crear una barrera con las antropologías de habla inglesa, hegemónicas, sino también con las antropologías de habla inglesa del resto del sur global, de África, del sudeste asiático. Entonces estaríamos confinándonos a nosotros mismos y esa es básicamente buena parte de la respuesta.
ところで、もしこれから日本語喋っていたらもっと分かることができるかもしれない。Sorry, I could do this in Japanese as well.
Bueno, acá ha surgido un pedido y es, dado que son más o menos 11:40, habría espacio para un par de preguntas. Si Gordon también está dispuesto a responder, ¿no? Entonces, Melissa.
I'm gonna talk in English first and then traduce. I would like to answer because it is very curious that you said that English is kind of like a revolutionary form to publicate the things, the articles in China. But at the same time, what about the other languages that are not the official in the countries? What about that discussions and it is really something important in those countries? It is maybe something that is really discussing there, or what about those other languages that are not the official or lenguas francas? That's it. Bueno, pues como que preguntando sobre las otras lenguas que no son solo las, digamos, las oficiales de los países, que si eso es algo que también se discute allá o qué, o pues cómo se trata eso allá, y eso.
The language politics get really complicated because much depends on how big a society is. So that, for example, Thomas Hyland Eriksson in Norway was telling me that if he were to write in Norwegian, nobody would read it in the anthropological world because there are so few anthropologists in Norway. For bigger societies, it's more possible to emphasize your own language. France, for example, or Japan, or Brazil. You know, you could say, my language is most important and I'm communicating. So that makes sense. Now, the role of the state is particularly powerful in China. I don't know of any other society in the world that has a large number of anthropologists where the state tries to censor them so much. And so English does have a particularly unique role in China. But it's worth remembering, China has about, I think, 1/5 of the world's people. You know, we're talking about a population that probably is as big or bigger than Latin America's population. I'm not sure, but it's a huge population. So China's really important. You can't neglect China in this accounting, and writing in English really is a savior. Now, I guess the final comment I'd want to make about language, because it's important. I really understand the Latin American perspective because I encounter it every week in World Council of Anthropological Associations. I mean, I always speak to my friends from Brazil, from Mexico, from Argentina, and I understand how within a Latin American context, Spanish makes perfect sense. But I also want to emphasize that in East Asia, language politics, whether in China or Japan or Korea, are somewhat different. And that has to be remembered. This is not universal. So it's a whole question of remembering that while I am talking about a global anthropology, the political situation and the relation to global hegemony in different societies is quite a bit different. And that somehow has to be bridged. I don't know how to do it yet. But I'll keep working on somehow trying, and all of us need to do the same.
Hola, hola. El profesor Mathews responde que las políticas lingüísticas son muy complicadas y dependen del lugar. Hablando con un académico noruego, Eriksson, él decía, si yo escribo en noruego, nadie me leería porque hay muy pocos antropólogos noruegos o hablantes de noruego. Y eso será muy diferente en el caso, por ejemplo, del Brasil, donde hay muchos hablantes de portugués y muchos antropólogos lusoparlantes, y es posible también para países como el Japón o Francia, por ejemplo, de tener sus antropologías en sus lenguas, pero que ciertamente sigue existiendo la necesidad de crear, digamos, una antropología global o algún tipo de lengua franca. Y en ese sentido también dice que el caso de China es particular porque China es un país en el cual hay digamos, un control político mucho más fuerte a este tipo de políticas lingüísticas, y en ese sentido escribir en inglés en China es una forma realmente de cambiar de alguna manera esa situación política interna. Y aunque lo pensemos como interno de la China, el profesor Mathews enfatiza, en la China viven 1/5 de las personas del mundo, entonces no es una situación que debamos dejar por fuera de la discusión.
Sí, ahora sí creo que es la última.
Pardon. In the study of the anthropology, the human condition is important. And then in China, is possible research about the Tai Chi? Tai Chi, because why? The Tai Chi had fundamental the movement of the energetic flux. The energetic flux causes development and well-being. And then there are research about this case.
Okay, no, very good question. Let me answer this. He is asking, is it possible to do research on Tai Chi? The answer is yes. The Chinese government would love you to do research on Tai Chi because Tai Chi has no political basis. Do not do research on civil society. Do not do research on gender, especially gays. No, stay away. Do not do research on minority nationalities like the Uyghur. You'll go to jail. Tai Chi is safe. So of course you can. The Chinese government would be very happy if everybody did research on Tai Chi because they would see it as harmless unless it becomes Tai Chi and Falun Gong. That's a problem.
Bueno, la pregunta era si se puede estudiar Tai Chi como parte de la antropología china, y el profesor Mathews responde que efectivamente, y el gobierno chino estaría muy feliz porque el Tai Chi no tiene ninguna base política, pero no se atrevan a estudiar minorías nacionales o asuntos, digamos, de índole más político, como las diferencias, por ejemplo, de género o las diferencias, por ejemplo, de orientación sexual, estudios sobre comunidades LGBTI, por ejemplo.
Sí, buen día. La pregunta es, ¿existe por fuera de la financiación gubernamental una antropología? ¿Qué hace? ¿Cómo subsiste? cómo investiga y crea en un oficio cotidiano?
Is there in Asia anthropology that it's not founded by government, that doesn't have official founding?
Yes, of course there is. Not in China so much, but most other anthropologies are not founded by government. They're not linked by government. Just to give you an example, in Hong Kong, much of my research has been on how to smuggle mobile phones from China to Africa. That's all illegal. Everybody I know is illegal. That money comes from the government, but the government can't ask me for it. No. So it's much freer of the government, except in China. And that's part of the massive difference that you see in these different anthropologies. I mentioned the East Asian Anthropological Association, where anthropologists from different East Asian societies come together. We can't meet easily in China because the government is so worried that somebody will criticize the Chinese government. But we certainly can meet in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and the government anywhere doesn't care. So it's free of government control, except in China.
Efectivamente, existen antropologías que no son financiadas oficialmente, excepto en la China, y un ejemplo es el trabajo del profesor Mathews, por ejemplo, que es financiado por el Estado, pero que es acerca del tráfico de teléfonos celulares desde China hacia África, y todo lo que eso implica es ilegal, y el gobierno de Hong Kong no puede preguntarle sobre esas actividades ilegales, a pesar de que está financiado su investigación por el gobierno, y que la gran excepción a eso ciertamente es la China.
Creo que ahora sí clausuramos. Nos vemos a las 2:30 con las siguientes exposiciones. ¿Otra? ¿No quieren dejar ir? Bueno, listo. Ya van 5 últimas. Adelante.
Profe, good. You are very welcome to Colombia and to this institution, Universidad del Cauca. And really, we enjoy your talk. About Asia, and I have a short question. My question is, how important is the migration of students from east to west to study anthropology? I remember several bunch of people from this area in the United States, for example, in England, in Europe. And this is important to see how much influence in Asia it has. You got it?
So you're asking about immigration from east to west.
Right. Preguntaba si...
Okay, now that's an interesting question that I want to follow up, because immigration from east to west is really interesting in terms of Anglo-American hegemony. Anglo-American hegemony does not mean white people like me. No, it means anybody based in the U.S. So Arjun Appadurai is an American anthropologist, or Li Jiang is an American anthropologist. Yan Yunxiang, these two famous Chinese anthropologists, are American anthropologists because they're based in America. And that's the way Anglo-American hegemony works. It's not based in racism, but it's based in, if you're any good, you'll be in America. That's the assumption that gets made. Now, overall, the migration of anthropologists is incredibly important. And I myself, of course, am a migrant in my own anthropology that I'm doing. My own view is that eventually, I hope we do what The Economist magazine recommends, get rid of all borders, so we won't need to worry about any of this anymore. But for now, migrant anthropologists, particularly from east to west, are indeed important, although salaries are higher in Japan and Hong Kong than they are in the US. You can make more money, you can have a higher salary if you are in Japan or Hong Kong than you can in an American institution. So many Americans now are coming to Asia because they want to make more money. Yeah, so that's a factor, yes.
Thank you. Me preguntaba que cuál era la relación entre Asia y el este y el oeste para los estudios en antropología y la influencia, obviamente, de la gente que regresa a Asia. Bueno, el profesor nos habla que es muy importante esas relaciones y que obviamente pues los antropólogos no solamente son los antropólogos blancos, sino que también hay de otros colores, si se puede decir, y que son antropologías que son incluyentes igualmente. Y que insiste en una antropología global. Y ahí está la clave de todo. Eliminando barreras también se puede, es un poco lo que concluye. Gracias.
Listo, entonces ahora sí, 2:30. Muchas gracias y esperamos la asistencia en las horas de la tarde. Gracias, Gordon.